We're going to start with the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is considered to be the keystone bone of the skull. On the ethmoid bone, we see a part that pokes up on top here on the superior aspect. This is the crista galli. This is the attachment point for the falx cerebri. On either side of it, we have a flat surface with a lot of little holes in it. And the cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, the bulb of it lays right down on top of this. If we turn this around and look from the anterior, we see a plate running right down the center. This is the perpendicular plate. This, along with the vomer, is going to help give us that nasal septum. On either side of the perpendicular plate on the top, we have our superior nasal concha, and on the bottom we have our middle nasal concha. And remember from the overview video that the inferior nasal concha is its own bone. Where this is going to sit in the body, if we look at the skull here, we can see that it is deeply embedded in the skull. Here's your crista galli. On either side you see your cribriform plate. I'm going to take the skull and move it around to a different viewpoint. From this viewpoint, if you look up the nose, we can see on either side, this is the perpendicular plate with the middle nasal concha. The superior nasal concha is so high up that we cannot see it from this viewpoint. What you're seeing from this view is the middle nasal concha around the perpendicular plate, and this of course would be the inferior nasal concha around the vomer, which are these are 3 separate bones, 2 inferior nasal concha and 1 vomer. But this is the ethmoid up here, superior middle nasal concha and perpendicular plate. This next bone, I have to say, is absolutely one of my favorites. This is the sphenoid bone, and there is so much going on this sphenoid bone. Let's take a look at the parts first. We have the greater wing here, the lesser wing on top. We have a little depression here called the sella turcica. Sella turcica is Latin for Turkish saddle. If you look at a Turkish saddle, you're going to say to yourself, that looks exactly like a sella turcica, and it does. What sits in the sella turcica is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is so important that it has its own little skull within the skull. How awesome is that? The pituitary gland, the sphenoid also has a number of foramina in it. Foramina is plural for foramen, and a foramen is a hole. If we look right here, we see the optic canal. This is for the transmission of cranial nerve 2, which is the optic nerve. So cranial nerve 2 comes through the optic canal and crosses, and where it crosses right over the pituitary gland, this is called the optic chiasm. Okay? We'll get into more detail on that when we look at the cranial nerves themselves. Okay? So this is the optic canal. Then if we look down here, we have a very large opening. This is the superior orbital fissure. What goes through the superior orbital fissure are cranial nerves 3, 4, 5 sub 1, and 6. 3 is oculomotor, 4 is trochlear, 5 sub 1 is the ophthalmic branch of trigeminal, and 6 is abducens. We go down, the next one we see is foramen rotundum for the transmission of 5 sub 2, maxillary division of trigeminal. Then we have foramen ovale for the transmission of 5 sub 3, mandibular division. Then we have a tiny little one down here. This is foramen spinosum. Foramen spinosum is not for a nerve, it's for the passage of the middle meningeal artery. Okay. If we turn our sphenoid over on the bottom, again, this is the superior orbital fissure we are seeing here, and we see little legs on the bottom. These two are your medial pterygoid plates, and these on the other side are our lateral pterygoid plates. We're seeing the greater wing and then the lesser wing from a different viewpoint, and you're also seeing your optic canal from a different viewpoint. I'd like to take a look at this bone, how it is embedded within the skull. Okay. So here we have the sphenoid. Again, you can see the the lesser wing and the greater wing. You can see our optic canal right here, sella turcica, foramen ovale, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. One thing that you do not see on the sphenoid itself that you do see on the model, if I can hold this down, do you see a very small gap right here? This gap, this is not a foramen, it's just a notch. But when we take this notch and we match it up with the next bone, we get a foramen. This is foramen lacerum. So foramen lacerum is not a true foramen. It's a foramen that is caused when two notches come together. If we turn this upside down, again, here we see the medial pterygoid plates and the lateral pterygoid plates. Also, if we take the skull and look from the front, you can see your superior orbital fissure from this viewpoint. And you can also see, if you look closely, the optic canal right very, very deep in the center here. So that is our sphenoid bone. This is the temporal bone, which is found on the temples. We're looking at the exterior surface at this time. Do you see the little branch that comes out here? This is the zygomatic process. So on the temporal bone, you have the zygomatic process. On the zygomatic bone, you would have the temporal process. And where the two meet is your zygomatic arch. We have a hole here that is our external acoustic meatus. On the bottom surface, we have two bumps. The one here that looks like a stylus is called the styloid process. That's how it got its name. This bump is called the mastoid process. It's called the mastoid process because mast is the root word for breast, and somewhere along the line thought it looked like a little boob, mastoid. We turn this around. You'll notice that there's a flat surface. This is the squamous portion, and we have a mountainous or petrous portion here. Okay. On the petrous portion, you're going to see another hole. This is for the entrance of our cranial nerves 7 and 8. This is your internal acoustic meatus. So cranial nerve 7 is facial, cranial nerve 8 is vestibulocochlear. Cranial nerve 7 comes through, it enters the internal acoustic meatus, and if we look back here, between the styloid process and the mastoid process is a little tiny foramen called the stylomastoid foramen. This is where the cranial nerve 7 will exit. There's another foramen that I would like to show you. Unfortunately, it does not show up as well on this model as it does on another model. This is one of the reasons why you need to look at multiple models of the same thing, because each model will show you something differently. I'm going to set this one down and pick up another model. This one does not show you the styloid process or mastoid process. They've been busted off, but you can see very well the carotid canal, which you could not see on the other one. Okay. And this is for the transmission of the internal carotid artery. I'm going to show you this bone on the skull. So if we look here, here's our temporal bone. Again, we have our mastoid process, our styloid process, and between them, you can see that little stylomastoid foramen. Then right after that, we see right here the carotid canal. Make sure you don't mistake that for the, can we see that? Mm-hmm. This is not the carotid canal, this is. What this is the jugular foramen. And you want to make sure that you can see the distinction between the two. Okay? So this is the carotid canal. This is the occipital bone, easily recognizable by this very large foramen called foramen magnum, and two smaller foramen on either side, which are the hypoglossal canal. What goes through the foramen magnum are your vertebral arteries and your spinal cord. What goes through the hypoglossal canal is cranial nerve 12, which is hypoglossal. If we were to put this into anatomical position, it would fit just like this. If we look on the exterior surface, we're going to see a large bump here with two lines, one above it, one below it. This is your external occipital protuberance, and what goes on either side of it is your superior nuchal line. The line below it would be your inferior nuchal line. Some skulls do not show a very well-defined inferior nuchal line. In fact, if we look at this skull, we can see our external occipital protuberance very well. So the line coming out of it is going to be our superior nuchal line. It does not show a great inferior nuchal line, but the one that comes out of the external occipital protuberance is always going to be superior. The last feature I'd like to mention on the occipital bone are these two rounded areas called the occipital condyles. This is where C1 atlas articulates with the skull. So if we look at our skull here, the rounded area is the occipital condyle. And if you recall, C1 atlas has the superior articular facets. Those are going to sit right on here, and the totality of the skull is sitting on this little bone. That's why C1 is called the atlas, because it's holding up the world, which is your skull. Occipital condyles. This bone is called the mandible. This is the movable bone in your skull. We have here the mandibular condyle. This fits in your temporomandibular joint. For here we have the coronoid process, not coracoid. Coracoid was on the scapula. This is the coronoid process. Coming down the side, this is the mandibular ramus. Where it bends here is the angle. In front, this is the body. You'll notice two small foramen here in the front. These are the mental foramen. What comes through the mental foramen is the mental nerve. The mental nerve is a continuation of the inferior alveolar nerve. It is a branch of 5/3 mandibular division of trigeminal, and it has its own name, mental foramen. We turn this around. On the inside, we see another foramen. This is our mandibular foramen. The mandibular foramen is where the inferior alveolar nerve enters. And again, that is a branch of 5/3 trigeminal. You can see how the mandible articulates with the skull in this joint, the temporomandibular joint right here. This tiny bone here is called the lacrimal bone. If you'll notice, there's a hole here. This hole is the lacrimal groove, which is going to allow for tears to go from the nasolacrimal duct down into the nasal passage.